He was only a poor student, tired, hungry, and carrying the weight of unpaid tuition. She was 71 years old, a woman of immense wealth, living alone in her mansion. When their worlds collided, no one believed it would lead to marriage. But just 7 days after the wedding, the young man discovered something that left him completely shocked. Daniel sat in silence, staring at the rent notice lying on his desk. The numbers swam before his tired eyes. He rubbed his forehead, wishing the headache would go away. His textbooks, stacked around him, looked less like tools of hope and more like heavy bricks holding him down. Every day was the same: classes in the morning, work in the evening, and long nights with little food in between. The cafeteria meals had become too expensive, so instant noodles were his daily companion. His friends often spoke of plans, travel, internships, opportunities, but Daniel kept quiet. Dreams seemed like luxuries meant for other people. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't careless. He was simply poor, and poverty didn't let go easily. His father had passed years ago, his mother worked endlessly in a small village, and he had no one to lean on. Still, Daniel held on to hope, fragile as it was. He wanted his degree, he wanted a better life, and most of all, he wanted dignity. That night, he prayed silently, not asking for riches, but simply for a way out, a chance, however small. He had no idea that the answer to his prayer would arrive in the most unexpected form. It was in the library where Daniel first met Eleanor. He hadn't noticed her at first, an older woman sitting quietly across the long oak table, reading a thick novel. She looked out of place among the restless students, yet she seemed completely at home among the books. Daniel was too focused on his notes, scribbling furiously, when her gentle voice interrupted. "You study with such intensity. What are you working on?" Startled, he looked up. Her eyes were clear, kind, but sharp with wisdom. She introduced herself simply as Eleanor. Daniel answered awkwardly, speaking of his course, his exams, his worries about failing. To his surprise, she listened with patience, asking questions, encouraging him to speak more. Their conversation stretched longer than he expected. Eleanor spoke of her late husband, of the years she had spent building businesses, of traveling the world, and yet finding comfort only in books. She didn't speak with arrogance, but with calm reflection. When Daniel finally stood to leave, she said softly, "You remind me of someone I once knew, someone who fought hard to rise above hardship." Her words lingered with him as he walked away. What Daniel didn't know then was that this meeting was not an accident. Eleanor had been watching him for some time, not out of suspicion, but out of curiosity. Something about his determination, his quiet dignity had touched her heart. Weeks passed, and somehow their meetings became frequent. Eleanor invited Daniel to her mansion one evening, insisting he deserved a decent meal. He arrived awkwardly, feeling out of place among the chandeliers and marble floors. She treated him with warmth, yet there was something unspoken in her gaze. That night, as they sat across from each other, Eleanor finally revealed her thoughts. "Daniel," she began softly, "I have lived a long life. I have money, property, and no children to inherit them. I have no family left. I have only time, and even that is running thin." Daniel listened, uneasy. Then she said words that froze him in his seat. "Marry me." The words hung in the air, almost unreal. Daniel blinked, thinking he had misheard, but Eleanor's expression was calm, sincere. She spoke again, explaining. She wanted companionship, someone to trust, someone who could care for her in her final years. In return, she promised to secure his future, to free him from the chains of poverty. Daniel's heart pounded. The idea was absurd. He was young, she was 71. People would laugh, gossip, judge. And yet, the weight of his reality pressed against him. This was not a scam, not a trick. It was an offer, a bridge out of struggle, offered by a woman who seemed genuine. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling of his dorm room, torn between fear and hope. By dawn, he had made his decision. The wedding was small, almost secret. Eleanor had arranged everything quietly. A few distant acquaintances filled the pews, but there were no cheering crowds, no curious classmates from Daniel's university. For Daniel, it felt less like a celebration, and more like stepping into a role he wasn't sure he could play. Eleanor, however, looked radiant in her own way. She did not try to look young, nor did she hide her age. Instead, she carried herself with grace, her silver hair shining softly beneath the colored light of the stained glass. When the vows were spoken, Daniel's voice trembled. He wasn't sure if it was nerves, guilt, or simply the weight of the choice he had made. Eleanor's voice, by contrast, was steady, calm, but filled with a strange tenderness. The ring slipped onto his finger like a key turning in a lock. As they walked down the aisle, Daniel noticed how the guests whispered behind cupped hands. Some looked shocked, others curious, a few even disapproving. He kept his eyes forward, telling himself it didn't matter. Outside, the bells rang softly, echoing against the walls of the church. Eleanor squeezed his hand gently, as if to say, "We will face this together." For Daniel, the world had shifted in ways he could not yet understand. He was married, not to a woman of his age, not to a classmate or a young love, but to someone who belonged to another time. And yet, in her eyes, he saw something steady, something that hinted this was only the beginning. Moving into Eleanor's mansion was like stepping into a dream, or perhaps into someone else's story. The house was vast, filled with rooms Daniel had no need for. Chandeliers hung from ceilings so high he felt dizzy looking up. Marble floors echoed with each of his hesitant steps. Eleanor gave him a tour, her voice carrying a softness that surprised him. She showed him the study where she kept her books, the conservatory where sunlight fell upon rows of orchids, the garden where roses still bloomed despite the season. Daniel nodded quietly, overwhelmed by it all. At night, he lay in a bed larger than his entire dorm room, unable to sleep. The silence of the mansion was heavy, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about bills or hunger. And yet, a strange unease filled him. Eleanor noticed his restlessness. "You are safe here, Daniel," she told him gently. "This place is yours as much as it is mine." Her words were kind, but Daniel couldn't help feeling like a guest in a museum. Every painting seemed to watch him. Every hallway seemed to whisper of a past he didn't belong to. Still, he reminded himself, this was the choice he had made. A new life, a new chance. What Daniel did not know was that the mansion itself held secrets. Secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about Eleanor. Despite the grandeur, life inside the mansion was lonely. Daniel and Eleanor shared meals together, but often in silence. She was kind, always polite, yet there was a distance between them that neither seemed to know how to cross. Daniel sometimes caught himself staring at her hands, delicate, lined with time, yet steady. He wondered what kind of life they had lived, what burdens they had carried. She seemed to notice his unspoken thoughts, but never pressed him to speak them aloud. At night, Daniel wandered the halls, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. He missed the noise of the dorms, the sound of laughter, even the discomfort of his tiny room. Here the silence was heavy. He was married, yet he felt strangely alone. Eleanor, too, carried her own silence. She often sat by the fire in the evenings, reading quietly, her glasses slipping down her nose. Sometimes she looked at Daniel with a softness that reminded him of his grandmother, other times with a sadness he could not explain. It wasn't unhappiness, it was something deeper, a shadow he couldn't name. Then, one night, Eleanor said something that unsettled him. "Daniel, there are things you do not yet know about me, but in time, you will." Her words lingered long after she had gone to bed. Daniel lay awake, wondering what secrets she could possibly be hiding. One restless evening, Daniel wandered into Eleanor's study. It was a beautiful room, lined with books, maps, and framed photographs from decades past. He ran his fingers across the spines of the books until he stumbled upon a stack of leather-bound journals. Curiosity tugged at him. He sat at the desk and opened one. Inside were Eleanor's handwriting, pages filled with memories, thoughts, confessions. He read about her childhood, about the war years, about her late husband, who had been both her partner and her rival in business. But then he stumbled upon something that made his breath catch. The last journal was recent. In it, Eleanor had written about him. She described the first time she saw him at the library, how his determination reminded her of her younger self, how his loneliness echoed her own. She confessed that she feared dying alone, and that marrying him was not about money but about finding someone she could trust with her heart. Daniel's chest tightened as he read the final line of one entry. "I know he may not love me, but perhaps he might care for me enough to see me not as an old woman, but as a soul who still longs to be understood." Daniel closed the journal slowly, guilt pressing heavily on him. He had thought of her as a lifeline, a way out of his poverty. But she had seen him as hope, as companionship. For the first time since the wedding, he felt tears sting his eyes. Daniel stood before the fireplace, Eleanor's journal trembling in his hand. She looked up at him, her expression calm, almost expectant. "I read them," he confessed, his voice low. "Your journals, I shouldn't have, but I did." Eleanor placed her book aside gently. "And what did you find, Daniel?" His throat tightened. You didn't marry me for money or to give me a future. You married me because you were lonely." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes, I wanted someone who wouldn't look at me as just an old woman with wealth, but as a person with dreams and fears still alive inside her." Daniel swallowed hard, shame rising in him. "I thought of this marriage as an escape, a way to survive. I didn't think about what it meant to you." There was silence. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice softer than ever. "I knew that. I knew why you said yes. But I hoped, in time, you might see me as more than just an arrangement." Daniel's eyes stung. For the first time, he truly saw her. Not as a rich woman, not as an aged figure, but as someone who had given him kindness when the world had given him nothing. "I see you now," he whispered. Eleanor's eyes glistened with quiet relief. The fire crackled between them, but the distance that had lingered for days finally seemed to fade. From that night on, something changed between them. The silence that once weighed heavily now felt gentle, like shared peace rather than distance. They began to spend mornings in the garden together. Eleanor would point out the roses she had planted years ago, telling Daniel the stories behind them. Daniel, in turn, began to share his dreams, not of riches, but of teaching, of writing, of making something meaningful with his life. She listened with the same patience she had shown in the library that first day. And slowly, Daniel found himself laughing again, something he hadn't done in a long time. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments when the difference in age felt like a wide river between them. But instead of ignoring it, they acknowledged it. Eleanor would joke about her wrinkles, Daniel about his messy hair, and somehow the laughter bridged the gap. It wasn't a love story in the traditional sense, but it was something rare. Two souls who had found each other in loneliness, and in that meeting discovered quiet companionship. 7 days had passed since the wedding, and Daniel felt like he had lived an entire lifetime within them. At first, he had been shocked by the arrangement, shocked by his own decision, by Eleanor's boldness, by the strange stares of others. But now, as he stood on the balcony, the sun setting in a blaze of gold, he realized something unexpected. He was not trapped. He was free. Free from poverty, yes, but more importantly, free from loneliness. Eleanor had given him more than shelter and wealth. She had given him understanding. In her presence, he didn't feel judged, mocked, or dismissed. She saw him for who he was, and in return, he had begun to see her not as a number, not as 71, but as a person with a soul as alive as his own. Turning back, he saw Eleanor sitting in her chair, the shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes watching the horizon. She looked tired, yet peaceful. Daniel walked toward her, kneeling beside her gently. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled faintly, brushing a hand against his hair like a mother, like a friend, like something beyond definition. "No, Daniel. Thank you." In that moment, Daniel understood the truth. Life had not given him riches, nor youth, nor easy paths, but it had given him something greater, the chance to share his journey with another soul, however different, however unexpected.